Hello, I'm Mary Phaeton and welcome to Cover to Cover. The program is presented by Writing WA, the peak body for writing and related activities in Western Australia. On Cover to Cover, I meet up with the author of Writing WA's Book of the Month. Today, my guest is Bernice Barry. In 2011, Bernice put aside her career to focus on her writing, and the result is this beautiful self-published biography of Georgiana Molloy, The Mind That Shines. Bernice, welcome to Cover to Cover.
Thank you, Mary. It's great to be sitting in this chair.
It's lovely to have you here. Now tell me about some of the motivating factors for you in deciding to research and write about Georgiana Molloy.
Well, for a very long time it wasn't a matter of writing about it, it was just finding out the truth, finding out the whole story and finding out the true story, because there were so many things that didn't seem to add up and I wanted to know what was really going on. So it was an investigation that interested me. It was a topic that I was interested in, 19th century literature, local history, botany, all those things. And then there were also some very sort of personal connections that were important to me.
Parallels to the fact that you'd moved from the UK to Perth Southwest.
A lot of obvious parallels, but also some very personal ones to do with family and childhood and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of personal motivation as well as the other interests.
So she was born Georgiana Kennedy in 1805 in Cumberland. Tell us about her early life.
Well, her early life was one of considerable privilege. She had a lot of opportunities. She had, in theory, a wonderful life ahead of her. But things really changed when her father died, when she was just 14. And he had basically squandered the family fortune. We don't know all the details, but it's fairly clear that that's what happened. And it became necessary for her mother to make some very significant changes in their world. So eventually the family home was sold. They ended up without a permanent home of their own and they were moving around from place to place.
She had a complicated relationship with her mother, didn't she?
She did, yes. And that was one of the parallels. She did have a complicated relationship. Her mother was a woman of very great sort of personal demands. I think she was probably a very selfish person, but she came from a previous generation where the most important thing was what people thought, social climbing, what people knew about your family, and that was all important.
And that was evident over and over again in the story of Georgiana. One of the things that people had previously thought, because there have been two biographies of Georgiana Molloy written previously, one by Alexandra Hasluck, was that she was a very pious religious person, but that wasn't what you discovered really, was it?
No, and that was one of the most important things. I had also got that impression that she was overly religious, unusually pious for the time, and what I found was that really wasn't the case. She was no more overt in the practice of her faith than any other woman of that time. And that was one of the first things that I noticed, was that the books that she brought with her to Western Australia were the kind of books, some of them, that a person who was very, very religious at that time would not have had with her.
What would be one example?
One example would be the collection of Robert Burns' poetry, which at that time was considered to be pretty risky stuff. You know, these were reworkings of old songs and they were not semi-pornographic. Bawdy would be the right word, yes. Yeah, pretty cheeky stuff.
Tell me about her early interest in plants as well.
Well, like other women in her social group at that time, she was interested in botany. She was quite interested in gardening, and that started really when she was a very small child. The first evidence that I found of anything to do with Georgiana and gardening was when she was, I think, 3 or 4 years old, and it was a ceremonial tree planting at the home. So that was very normal, but gradually as time went on, she became more interested in the botanical side of things, as well as just simply the gardening, for the way that the garden looked.
But she kept plant samples and pressed flowers and all that kind of thing right from the beginning, didn't she?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I found something that showed, I think it was in a letter, that where she referred to her dried flower collection that went back to 1821. So certainly as a teenager, as a young woman, she was collecting dried specimens, but I think probably at that time it was more typical would be to collect a dried flower collection that looked pretty, which is not the main aspect of a botanical dried flower collection.
No. But she had some skills. I guess that's the main part to take away from there. Now let's talk about John Molloy, because she didn't know him terribly well before she married him. He was 19 years her senior?
About that, yes, a little bit less than that, I think.
And there'd been a fair bit of mystery and myth around his life as well, which you were able to really go deeply into and blow some of that apart. Tell me a bit more about John Molloy.
Well, John Molloy, to begin with, I didn't think particularly highly of him, but I really changed my mind. I think he was a wonderful man and a very, very good husband and life partner and father. But to begin with, I ended up with so much information about John Molloy that I thought it would be good to write two books, one about Georgiana and one about John Molloy, that would kind of work together. But there was a mystery about his life as well, and that was one of the other things that became very important to make available the true story of his life.
Because in fact, as a result of that, what you decided to do was put a lot of research aside. But you gave me a great example in telling me that about the power of the internet and how increasingly useful the internet is in researching historical work.
I'm glad you asked that question, because it's one of the main driving factors in some of the things that I did put into the book. There's nothing that really can replace first-hand sources, touching objects, going to places. You feel a kind of direct energy with history. But the internet, I could not have done what I did in terms of research without the internet. I think the example that you're referring to is where I was using satellite images.
Yes.
One of the things I wanted to do was to try and follow John Molloy's journey during the Napoleonic Wars. So using the internet, I found a book called The History of the Rifle Brigade, which tracks literally village by village where the battalion camped at night, where they went through a forest, where they fought to take a bridge from the French army. And I used that online, and then I used online maps to try and find those villages again. Most of them were spelt in completely different ways, but the maps allowed me to find them. And then I used that with satellite images to literally follow John Molloy's marching through Spain and Portugal. And there was one point where I read a description in the book about how they were fighting to take this bridge. He called it the Battle of Benavente Bridge. And I found the village, and when I looked on the satellite image, it's now quite a big place with a big modern road that goes across the river. But on the satellite image you can see where the old bridge was. So I was technology allowed me to literally follow in his footsteps, and that, I think, as a writer, if you're a writer who thinks in visual ways, that really helps to embed you in the life of the person that you're trying to connect with, because that's really what you're trying to do.
I want to go back to Georgiana and John and the fact that they didn't particularly know each other well when they were married, but I think Georgiana, at the point in her life, she had all this internal family conflict and she was really ready to escape from all of that. And when they married, it was the next day they left for Western Australia.
Yes. Well, they did. They set off immediately after the wedding, but they went to Glasgow and they stayed overnight and had their honeymoon night in Glasgow. And then it was actually it was weeks before in fact months before they boarded the ship, the Warrior. That all took a long time. They stayed in London and they stayed on the south coast as well. But they did leave immediately after the wedding.
So when they arrived at the Swan River colony, that was still in its very nascent stages. How come they ended up in Augusta?
Well, most of the ideal land that they had envisaged they would take as a land grant, most of that had already been taken by the people who were able to get the first pickings. And Georgiana also found the weather very hot. There were mosquitoes, there were fleas. She was very pregnant, and they were quite keen to look for some alternative. And Governor Stirling had very recently had some explorations further south in the region which is now Augusta. And he was very keen to extend the colony, because even after, it was about a year, even after a year, it was already very evident that the Swan River colony as it was, which is now Perth, really couldn't accommodate or upkeep the number of people who were arriving. There wasn't enough land. So if Governor Stirling's personal project that he was so keen to flourish was to flourish, then he needed to expand, and he managed to persuade them that it would be good to move to a sub-colony, to found a sub-colony.
And I mean, it's worth pointing out that John Molloy was quite senior in the leadership of the colony. What they weren't just ordinary settlers by any means. So
yes.
he had a senior role when they went to Augusta. What was
yes, he
that
did.
about?
Well, it's interesting. He was the resident magistrate, which is basically to do with the law. But I think sometimes it doesn't get spotted that he was also the government resident. And they're actually two completely different roles. And the government resident is a sort of quasi-ministerial role. He was literally the representative of the government in the new colony. And Georgiana wrote very proudly to her mother, he is the second most important man in the colony apart from the governor, which wasn't quite true, but it was not far from the truth. He was important, he was significant.
When they arrived in Augusta, it was literally to natural bushland.
Yes.
What was life like for them at the beginning of what ended up being 8-10 years in the region?
Yes, she was about 10 years in Augusta. In the very beginning, or?
In the very beginning.
In the very beginning, she spent a lot of time alone in a tent on the beach with a woman that she barely knew, who was supposed to be her lady's maid, who had no experience at being a lady's maid. She had none of the things that she really needed around her, and she was about to give birth. They had supplies with them, so certainly in those first few weeks they didn't go hungry. Later on they did nearly starve, literally nearly starved. Yeah. But it was very lonely and desolate, I think would be the word.
And with Captain Molloy away so much of the time, it would be such an overwhelming task to even know where to begin to get your life set up.
Yes.
But she did start gardening reasonably quickly, didn't she?
She did. The priority to begin with was to grow food, was to clear the land and start to grow food, because there would come a point where the government supplies would stop coming or might not arrive, which is exactly what happened in that first year. So yes, vegetables to begin with, and then as soon as possible to begin to grow flowers.
There are many poignant moments in the story, and one of them was when you talk about how you noticed a pathway to a memorial plot down in Augusta for the two of her children who died.
Yes. It was, there's a sketch map of the plot of land in Augusta drawn by John Molloy, and I'd looked at it for many years, and most of the lines are vertical and horizontal, as you would if you were planning on a new plot for vegetables and growing crops. But one of the lines in the drawing, in the sketch map, was a diagonal, and I always wondered why. And then when I realised what had happened and where the children were buried, I literally woke up one night and suddenly realised, and went and looked again at the sketch map in the middle of the night on my computer, and I realised that the pathway went from the front door of the cottage to the place where the children were buried. So as soon as the house was built, even before the rest of the garden was created, she was walking daily, as a mother would, maybe several times a day, to the place where her children were buried, and the rest of the garden grew around that diagonal pathway.
That would, in itself, would have been a difficult thing to leave behind, but they did leave Augusta, as you mentioned, after 10 years, to go to Vass, which is the Busselton region.
It's Busselton, yes.
Yeah. Why did they move?
There was a lot of pressure from several different directions. The main reason really was that Augusta, as it was, could not really ever become self-sufficient. There wasn't enough flat land, enough fertile land for them to grow the crops that they needed. The Vass offered that opportunity. The land was flatter, they could grow crops easily, and it was also much easier for ships to come and go from Perth and from Albany into the Vass.
It was an incredible life of toil. I don't think we could emphasise enough what hard work it was being a settler, and as you said, they starved, they had to scrabble around for every bit of food that they could get. But in amongst all of that, Georgiana begins collecting specimens. Why did that happen?
Well, she had been collecting for a while, but in a very informal way. There was an obsession in Britain for things from foreign places. It was part of the whole colonial excitement. And so she'd been sending seeds and sending plants to family and to friends, not just plants, but shells, anything that she was given by an Aboriginal person. People were fascinated by these objects. But then she was invited, really through a connection with Ellen Mangles, the governor's wife. She was invited to send specimens to James Mangles. And she rose to the occasion in spite of all the pull on her time.
Yeah, it was incredible. And their letter writing, there weren't too many letters from him back to her, maybe half a dozen?
It's something like 6, yes. At least that's all that we have evidence of.
But it seemed they developed in their correspondence quite a nice kind of a professional relationship, but still she told him things about her life that were quite personal.
She did. I think she had a great professional respect for him because he was an expert in a field that she felt she didn't know a lot about, but she made it her business to find out. But she respected him, and also it's important to remember that really her husband, John Malloy, was the only person that she could talk to, the only person she'd been able to talk to for a decade about things that were personal, because there were no other ladies, in inverted commas, around her.
Where are the specimens that she collected today?
The first collection from Augusta, as far as I know, has disappeared. And the second 2 collections are mainly in Kew Herbarium near London and in Cambridge Herbarium, the Herbarium of Cambridge University. I think there are some in a Swedish herbarium as well.
Yeah. I feel a bit cheeky asking this question, but
dear.
I did wonder how collecting plant specimens and sending them to England made her a botanist.
That's an interesting question. I'm not qualified to make a judgment, but I'm not sure that in some senses you would call her a botanist. She was certainly a collector. She was a very skilled collector, more skilled than some of the professional collectors in the colony at the time. I'm not sure that she was a botanist in the sense that her main objective wasn't to study the botany of the plants themselves in a scientific way and to find out more about how they grow, how they spread, how they change over time. But she is known as a botanist, and I think for most people's purposes, I think that sums up very well the work that she did, because it was to a very high level of expertise.
The very front page of The Mind That Shines is an acknowledgement of the Wadandi people of the Southwest, and that was something that was very important to you. Tell me why.
It was one of the things that I felt very sure of when we decided to self-publish the book, and it's one of the advantages of self-publishing is that I could say, I want this on the front page and nothing else. It was important because I live in an area where I couldn't fail to be aware of the people who've been there before me, the flora, the fauna, the people. And also I wanted to acknowledge the importance of that story, the story of the Aboriginal people, which I wanted to tell in the book. Again, I don't feel really qualified to tell that story because most of the most of the anecdotes that I've been able to find have been told through the European voices of colonists, not through Aboriginal voices. And so one way of trying to acknowledge and value the Aboriginal story was having the very first page, the acknowledgement of country, and nothing else on the page.
Where possible, though, you did use names of the Aboriginal people in the story, and I guess it was tricky in terms of where there was some altercation between the settlers and the Aboriginal people, that you never got the Aboriginal person's side of the story, did you? It was always just the settler taking out retribution, but not knowing what happened before. Frustrating?
Very frustrating. I was aware over and over again when I was finding out about a particular incident that happened that it was quite unusual to find the name of the Aboriginal person. Often it was just 3 Aboriginal men died, or he shot an Aboriginal man. I never found the name of an Aboriginal woman. And another aspect of it was sometimes, particularly in diaries and journals, the name given to the Aboriginal person who's being referred to isn't even their Aboriginal name. It's the name that they were given by the Europeans.
Yeah.
Often not a particularly pleasant name either.
It makes it difficult to tell the story well when you have so little background. It was 1842, I think, when Georgiana fell pregnant with baby Georgiana in Vass. And she knew she'd had difficult pregnancies all along. She knew that she was unlikely to survive that pregnancy.
Yes.
And in fact, she lived 3 months after the birth of Georgiana.
Yes.
It must have been heartbreaking to write that.
Yes, it was. I remember going into the study, sitting at the computer, writing that part of the story. And I came out when I'd finished that section and walked in, and my husband Mike was sitting there, and he said, "What's the matter?" because I was crying. And I said, "Georgiana's died." And of course then each time I did a major edit, I had to rewrite it. So there were a lot of tears at several points during the writing of the book.
I found it hard to understand because she was in her late 30s, wasn't she? And I found it really hard to understand why they didn't do more to try and keep her alive. It was so frustrating. But you do have to understand the circumstances were entirely different, don't you?
Yes, that's right. Yes. I think Georgiana probably thought that, like most other women, that whatever happened was God's will, and they basically just had to keep on surviving. You know, if children came, they did.
I want to ask you about self-publishing. You've mentioned it a couple of times and the freedoms that it's given you, but you really didn't think that you'd do more than, you know, print off 50 copies at home and hand them out to a few local libraries at first.
That's right.
So what changed?
I think we just decided that we would try to make the book more widely available. 1 or 2 people had read the manuscript and said that they'd enjoyed it, and we decided basically to fund it and see if we could spread the story a little bit further.
You'd also had a lot of support, though, from a descendant of Georgiana Malloy, Patrick Richardson Bunbury, to whom he's one of the 2 people that you've dedicated the book to. And you kind of made him a promise, didn't you, to show him a book?
Yes.
So perhaps you could tell me the story of how you presented it to him.
Well, Patrick Richardson Bunbury had always been a great supporter, and sometimes without realising it had pointed me in the direction of a particular research route that had led me to some very exciting things. And we'd been working together in this way for several years, and in the end I said, you know, Patrick, I promise you one day I'm going to give you a book and I'm going to hand it to you. And I didn't tell him that the book was dedicated to him, and we arranged to meet him for dinner. And I said, here's the book, and handed him the book. And I had a little bookmark in it, and I said, and you have to open it at this page. And he opened it at the page and smiled. And fortunately, I have a photograph of that moment. It was one of the most special moments, because I felt as if it wasn't just the outcome of my own research, it was the outcome of many more years that Patrick's been involved in working on the research of his family and his ancestors. So I think he's been very pleased.
Yeah, precious moment. Bernice, I always ask at the end of an interview about a West Australian book recommendation, and you've recommended Joan London's The Golden Age. Tell me why.
Yes, I've chosen this book, The Golden Age, because I think as a reader, for me, it's the perfect read. It works on so many different levels. It appears to be simple, straightforward writing, but that's her skill, and it's actually not. It's a very deep story. It's a story on a number of different levels. Her writing appeals to me because it's very cinematic, it's very visual. An example of that is in the chapter called The Cockatoos, where it's almost as if she's behind a camera and she's controlling the camera and using wide shots and zooming in. So in that chapter she describes how in the orphanage, in the home, the children are sitting eating, and it's very close description, and then we hear cockatoos travelling overhead and the camera zooms out, but we follow the cockatoos over, and then we follow them and look down onto the kitchen of a house where Frank's parents are sitting, and then we zoom in to what's going on in that kitchen. And she takes you with her as a reader in a very subtle way.
I look forward to reading your recommendation then. And Bernice, thank you so much for being with me on Cover to Cover today, and congratulations on a beautiful book, Georgiana Malloy, The Mind That Shines.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being here.
To find book club notes for Georgiana Malloy, The Mind That Shines, and our other books of the month, plus reviews of other great West Australian books, go to the For Readers section of Writing WA's website. If you don't have a local bookshop where you can buy the books featured on Cover to Cover, then you can buy them via Crow Books in Perth. Place your order by phone and the books will be posted out to you. If you've missed out on seeing past episodes of Cover to Cover, you can watch them via our YouTube channel. They're a great way for you to discover our new favourite West Australian authors and find out more about them. Next month on Cover to Cover, I'll meet best-selling rural author Fiona Palmer. She's been described as one of Australia's queens of romance, and we'll be discussing her latest rural romance novel, The Sadler Boys. Thanks for joining me. Thanks so much to those of you who've sent us feedback this month, and see you next time.